Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today is the British serial child killer Beverley Allitt. She was a nurse that would become to be known as the Angel of Death. This was a suggested case, so thank you for that. I appreciate any suggestions that you guys have. I also just wanted to let you know, some people have approached me about a Patreon account, and I've set one up now, so I'll put the link in the description for anybody that wants to support me on that, whilst we're trying to make the channel grow and obviously get to monetization. If you can, or you simply don't want to, completely understandable, not everyone will. But I'm just putting it out there in case anybody does actually want to support me on that. And I appreciate everything that you guys do for me, so thank you so much for watching my videos. I'd just like to let you know, I mean no disrespect to anyone I talk about today, I've just gathered this information from the internet and compiled it into a video for educational purposes. Beverley Gail Allitt was born on the 4th of October in 1968 to her parents Richard and Lillian. Her father worked in an off-licence and her mother was a cleaner at a local school. Beverley was one of 4 children, having 2 brothers and a sister. And they all grew up in Corby Glen near Grantham in England. As she was growing up, she did kind of have these worrying tendencies, so Beverley would very much seek attention. She would pretend that she was injured, or maybe she was slightly injured, maybe it was a scrape, but she would bandage that up and make it look a lot worse than it was. And then when people would want to go and examine it to see if she was okay, she would never let them. So it kind of seemed like she was making more of a big deal out of it than actually was. And her attention seeking just seemed to get worse the older she got, and she also would become aggressive towards others too. She attended Charles Reed Secondary Modern School, but you know, at home she was really well behaved. She would help with her chores, she would even volunteer to do babysitting jobs and things like that, which that money she would then put aside to try and save up. As she got to her teens though, her illnesses just seemed to multiply and she just was apparently ill all of the time. She'd spend a lot of time in hospitals and she would actually go a lot. I don't know if you guys have really seen this before, but sometimes there are people that will go to the hospital and they will pretend that they have these symptoms, look it up on the internet, pretend they've got these symptoms, and they will do it just to seek attention and things like that. And that is kind of what Beverley did. She would go and she would put on these symptoms so that people would be all around her and they'd be thinking, you know, trying to figure out what was wrong with her, and most of the time it was nothing. It actually ended up as bad that she had her appendix removed, which was completely healthy, so it didn't need to be removed, but she was putting on the symptoms of appendicitis, and so worried, you know, they removed it, but it was perfectly healthy. And then her healing time was really, really slow because obviously she had the surgical scar. She messed with it all the time, therefore inhibiting it to heal. And she was also known to self-harm too. Eventually, the medical practitioners would kind of cotton on to what she was doing. They're seeing her all the time. She's saying she's got all these symptoms and there's nothing wrong with her. And they start to realise that she's a time waster, she's attention-seeking. And so they just kind of stopped believing her. And once they cottoned on, she just moved on. She went to another doctor's, and that's actually known as Dr. Hopping, and that's just what she did. She just, every time someone cottoned on, she just moved on to the next one. Beverley left school at the age of 16 and she went on to attend a pre-nursing course in Grantham College, where she would meet a man called Stephen Biggs in 1987. It seemed that Stephen was quite unsure of her until she demanded to be his girlfriend. He went on to eventually buy her a ring, but she would never set a date for marriage. She would never hold his hand in public. They had these violent fights where Stephen would be kneed in the groin. Among other lies, like she also claimed that one of her ex-boyfriends had raped her and that Stephen had raped her, which was lies. There were more stranger things though. When she was talking to nurses, when she actually got into nursing, she went on to claim that a poltergeist had stuck a carving knife into a pillow, set the bedroom curtains on fire, and fed tablets to her landlady's dog. At one stage, police were called in to investigate a kitchen fire, the appearance of human feces in a refrigerator, which is just beyond disgusting. She went on to train as a nurse and she was suspected of, again, smearing feces on the walls in the nursing home that she trained in and smearing them, I don't know, in different places too. Along with that, her absentee record was really, really high. She was always off, she was always ill. Stephen would later go on to say that she was aggressive, she was manipulative, and she was very deceptive too. She would often claim that she had false pregnancies, as well as I mentioned before, rape, before their relationship actually did end. In 1990, she went on to have her first job interview, which she didn't actually get. She was the only nurse on her course to fail to get a job immediately after she had qualified. Boston Hospital turned her down on the grounds of insufficient experience. But back at Grantham Hospital, there was a bad shortage of staff, and I mean bad, and it was on the children's ward. Beverley went on to beg for a chance to further her training, to basically give her a chance, and they did. They were that desperate for staff. She was a well-trusted woman, and so they did. They gave her a job. It was a 6-month contract though, and it was for Ward 4 on the children's ward. Her parents were pleased that their daughter's ambition had finally been realised, that she was given a chance and she was doing what she really wanted to do in life. There were only 2 trained nurses on the day shifts there, and only 1 for nights when she actually started. And that might explain how her violent and attention-seeking behaviour just went on for as long as it did, without being detected. I'm going to go through these events in date order just to let you know so that there's no confusion. So, on the 21st of February in 1991, 7-week-old Liam Taylor was admitted to the children's ward, to Ward 4. He had a chest infection and he would become her first victim. She went out of her way to let his parents know that he was in really good hands. And she kind of persuaded them, because of that, to go home and get some rest. When they came back, she told them that Liam had suffered a respiratory emergency, but that he had recovered. She volunteered an extra night to watch over him that night, and so did, obviously, his parents. His parents stayed with him too. Liam had another respiratory crisis just before midnight. But it was felt that he'd come through that quite well. He was on the way to sort of recovering over that, even though they didn't know the reason behind it. At some point, Beverley was left alone with Liam, and his condition then got drastically worse. He became deathly pale, and all these red blotches appeared all over his face, at which point Beverley called for the resource team, the emergency resource team, to come in. Some of the nursing staff were confused as to why none of the alarms had gone off, so, as most of you will know, they have monitoring on, they have all these things, and if someone stops breathing or the sats start going, alarms start ringing, and obviously people rush in. But this didn't happen in Liam's case. Liam suffered a cardiac arrest, and despite the medical team's best efforts, they tried so hard to save this little boy. He ended up with brain damage due to lack of oxygen. And basically he was going to be only kept alive by machines. So on medical advice, his parents made the absolutely heartbreaking decision to take him off life support. They didn't want their little baby boy to be prodded and poked. If it was futile, if there was nothing that could be done and he couldn't be saved, they didn't want that for him. They just wanted him to pass away in peace. And on the 22nd of February in 1991, Liam passed away in his father's arms. His cause of death was recorded as heart failure, and Beverley was never questioned about Liam's death. Only 2 weeks after Liam had died, her next victim was admitted on the 5th of March. Timothy Hadwick, an 11-year-old little boy who was disabled, he had cerebral palsy, and he had been admitted following an epileptic fit that occurred in school. A nurse called Mary Ree asked Beverley to admit Timothy admit him and watch him while she was going to go and do a drug rounds. The nurse hadn't even finished the drug rounds when Beverley calls out that something is wrong. The emergency resource team rush in. They have a paediatric specialist there as well. Everyone's jumping on, everyone's trying to do everything that they could, but despite their best efforts, unfortunately, at 6:15, he was pronounced as dead. An autopsy later failed to find an official cause of death, but it was just blamed on his epilepsy, basically. On the 3rd of March, 15-month-old Kayleigh Desmond was admitted with a chest infection. She was to become her 3rd victim. During her time in the ward, Kayleigh really seemed to be recovering well from her ordeal. Her infection seemed to be clearing up, and she spent 5 days on the ward. On the 8th of March, however, Kayleigh went into cardiac arrest, in the very same bed where Liam Taylor had died just a fortnight before. Can you guess who had been left alone with her? Yes, it was Beverley. This time though, the resource team luckily were able to revive her. She was then transferred out to another hospital in Nottingham, where she miraculously recovered from this unknown incident. They had no idea why it had happened, but once she was transferred out, she just recovered. The doctors there actually discovered an odd puncture hole under her armpit during one of the thorough examinations. And they also discovered an air bubble near the punch mat, but they just put it down to an accidental injection site. And no investigation was ever initiated on that. There'd been a lot of what people thought was a string of bad luck on the ward. Yes, it was winter, and yes, a lot more people get poorly in winter. There's a lot of poorly children out there, there's a lot of poorly people out there, and so sometimes hospitals get overrun with them. And yes, unfortunately, people do pass away. And so people just thought it was a sort of a string of bad luck, and the staff were finding it really hard. Nobody wants to lose the patients, especially not children who have barely lived a life yet. On the 20th of March, 5-month-old Paul Cramson became her next victim. He was actually in the ward because he had a non-serious bronchial infection, and he begins improving. He's getting up to the point where he's just about to be discharged because he's doing that well. That was until Beverley, who was left alone with him once more, quickly asked for help because she felt like Paul was suffering from insulin shock. He nearly went into a coma on 3 separate occasions. Each time, luckily, the doctor did manage to revive him, but they couldn't explain his fluctuation in insulin levels. They decided that he needed more help, and so they decided to send him out to another hospital on a glucose drip because he needed more help fast. And so they did. They called an ambulance, off they sent him, and guess who rides with him? Beverley, because she is so concerned, and she's just this really caring nurse that just wants to make sure that he's okay on his journey. And so she goes with him. His blood was actually taken at the time, and it was sent off for testing. Now, it didn't come back for a number of days, I think a couple of weeks actually. So this information wasn't found out until later, but his insulin levels at the time to be 500 milliunits per litre of blood. Now, a normal baby's insulin level should be 10 to 15 milliunits per litre of blood, so that is drastically higher. But it was either thought to be a rogue sample, because obviously this has happened weeks after anyway, and he did recover, and so it was either a rogue sample or his pancreas has simply made too much insulin on that occasion and it had self-resolved. So then no investigation was done once more. As I said, at the Nottingham hospital, he recovered. Let me just say, Paul was really lucky to survive her attack, and you will find out especially why later on, but it seemed like she was really intent on taking his life, but he survived, and I really do think he was very lucky to survive. The thing was, at this point, her colleagues felt sorry for her. They thought that she was new and she was lovely. And she was so caring, she was such a lovely girl. She had been at all of these instances where these children had either died or gone off and been really, really poorly, and she was always there. And they just thought it was really unlucky, and they actually felt sorry for her. They never ever once, it never crossed their mind at least, to think that she was the one causing it. The very next day, 5-year-old Bradley Gibson is admitted. He suffered from pneumonia, but he suddenly went into an unexpected cardiac arrest. Luckily, he was saved by the resus team. They performed blood tests, and again, it showed that his insulin levels were really, really high, and they just didn't have a clue why. It literally dumbfounded them and made zero sense to the doctors. Beverley was alone with him again that night, and once more, he suffered another cardiac arrest. Luckily, they managed to revive him again, and they actually transported him out to another hospital, and he survived. He recovered, and he survived. So Beverley starts at the hospital, and then there's these really, really strange occurrences and strings of children having high insulin levels or children having cardiac arrests, and it's all when Beverley is in the room. But at this point, there was just no suspicion on her whatsoever, allowing her to just carry on with her spree. There was no evidence to say that those things should have happened to those children. Like, there was no real cause for it. They couldn't find anything wrong. Like, normally insulin levels, your pancreas is acting up or whatever, but there was nothing like that. So it was weird. But again, there was no suspicion on her whatsoever, and so it allowed her to continue her spree. On the 22nd of March, 2-year-old victim Yip Hung Chan, also known as Henry, had been admitted following a fall the previous day. Beverley went on to raise the alarm after he suffered an oxygen desaturation attack, in which he turned blue and was in distress. The team rushed in with oxygen, which he responded really well to. He went on to then have another attack, which resulted in him also being transferred out to another hospital in Nottingham, where, miraculously, he recovered. His symptoms were attributed to the fractured skull that he had sustained during his fall. On the 1st of April, a bout of gastroenteritis brought in Becky Phillips, who was just 2 months old. She was actually a twin. So we had Becky and Katie, and they were actually born premature. And because of that, worried parents, they just wanted to make sure that everything was okay. Premature babies often can become very ill, and they can often get ill quite a lot. And so they have to be kept sometimes for observation, which is what happened then. Beverley took over her care, and 2 days later, the alarm was raised. Beverley claimed that Becky appeared hypoglycemic and cold to the touch. But again, there was no cause found as to why that had happened. And so baby Becky was sent home to be with her mother. During the night, she went into convulsions and cried out in apparent pain. They called a doctor out who suggested that she had colic. The parents kept her in their bed so that they could obviously watch over and keep an eye on her, and she died during the night. Despite an autopsy, pathologists couldn't find her cause of death. Now, out of sheer panic and caution, her twin was admitted. Katie was admitted too. It was just as a precaution because obviously one of the daughters had just died. What if the same thing that was wrong with her is also wrong with Katie? And so they brought her in. Unfortunately for her, Beverley was again on shift. It wasn't long before she was shouting for assistance with resuscitation team because baby Katie needed to be revived. She had stopped breathing. Now, the efforts to revive Katie were successful, but 2 days later, she suffered a similar attack, and that resulted in the collapse of her lungs. Following another revival effort, she was transferred out to Nottingham, where they found that 5 of her ribs were broken, and she had actually suffered serious brain damage due to the oxygen deprivation. In an unbelievable turn of events, Katie's mother, Sue Phillips, was just so grateful to Beverley for saving her baby's life because obviously Beverley was there. She was the one who was calling it out and getting the people in, and she felt like she saved her life. She actually asked her to be Katie's godmother, which she willingly accepted. Despite being the one that killed her sister, despite being the one that tried to kill her, that resulted in her partial paralysis, cerebral palsy, and sight and hearing damage. I mean, it's just unbelievable. How dare she agree to that? She murdered one of Sue's daughters. She caused irreparable damage to her second little girl, and she then becomes her godmother. But it was what she wanted. Everyone was hailing her. She had seen the issue. She had reported the issue. She was there in the forefront and everyone was praising her for it, thinking that she was just going the extra mile. She was getting all the attention that she was craving. And I just can't imagine how Sue felt after she learned the truth about Beverley. It's just awful. 4 more victims followed, but because there was a high number of these strange attacks with no real explanation in otherwise healthy patients, and the fact that Beverley was always there with these patients when these things happened, it did finally raise suspicion at the hospital. Her crimes were brought to an end with the death of her final victim on the 22nd of April in 1991. 15-month-old Claire Peck was an asthmatic who was a regular on the ward. She would come in, she would have a treatment, she would get better, and then she would go home. And with a lot of asthmatics, the case is the same, you know. Sometimes it sparks up and they need extra help until they bring them in, and it happens quite a lot with asthmatics, especially children. As the doctor went off to talk to the family to reassure them, he left Beverley in the treatment room with Claire alone. Almost immediately, she raises the alarm to say that this little girl has stopped breathing. The resus team rush in, they manage to revive her luckily, and once more, the doctor goes to speak to the family again. Within 90 seconds or so, the alarm is raised again by Beverley. Claire has stopped breathing again. This time though, unfortunately, they weren't able to revive her and she did pass away. An autopsy was done and it concluded that Claire actually died of natural causes. An inquiry was initiated by the hospital by a specific Dr. Nelson Porter. He was looking at the numbers and he was highly alarmed by the amount of cardiac arrests on the children's ward in the last 2 months. It was initially suspected that it was an airborne virus, but obviously nothing of that was ever found. All the staff were so concerned, but they never did really think that the cause of this could have been one of their own. It was never crossed their minds that somebody put in charge of caring for these children was the one that was killing them and attempting to kill them. 18 days later, tests uncovered abnormal levels of potassium in Claire's blood, and that resulted in the police being called straight away. Her body was exhumed and traces of lignocaine was found in her system. Now, this drug is used on cardiac arrest, yes, in adults. It is never in the case of a baby having a cardiac arrest, and so obviously that sparked questions. The police superintendent that was assigned to the case, Stuart Clifton, suspected foul play, and he examined all the other cases that had been handed over the past 2 months. He found a clear similarity with most of the cases, very, very high levels of insulin in their blood with most of the cases. They also found these blood samples that were supposed to have been gotten rid of but actually hadn't, and they found 9 blood samples. In that fridge, one of them was Paul Crampson's sample, so they ran that again, and they found that his blood level of insulin at the time was not 500 like they initially suspected, which at the time was very, very high for a child anyway, but in fact it was 47,000 milliunits per litre of blood, which was actually the second highest ever recorded in the world. When they looked into the discrepancies between the two tests, because obviously the first one said 500, now this was saying 47,000, that is a huge difference. They found that the machine in Cardiff was actually only calibrated to go up to 500, and so when the blood sample went off the charts saying that it is way more than 500, I guess nobody really realised and just assumed it was 500, and that's why that was marked down as that. It was concluded that because of that, the insulin was definitely injected, and therefore they were looking into a possible killer in the Grantham hospital. He then found out that Beverley had previously reported the key to the insulin fridge actually being stolen and going missing. All records were checked, parents of the victims were all interviewed, and security cameras were installed. Suspicions were raised once more when these record checks revealed missing daily nursing logs, which matched up from the time that Paul Cramson was there, who was actually a fourth victim. When 25 separate suspicious incidents with 13 victims were identified, 4 of whom were dead, they found that the only common factor was the presence of Beverley Allitt at every single episode. By the 26th of July in 1991, police felt like they had enough evidence to charge Beverley Allitt with murder, but it wasn't until November that she would actually be formally charged. They go and arrest her, and the way in which she is arrested is very, very strange. Like, she didn't look worried at all. She was smiling, and she just looked completely fine. When Beverley was interrogated, she was really calm. She showed restraint, and she was just denying any sort of part in these attacks. Instead, she was just insisting that she'd simply been caring for them. The police went on to search her house, and they found parts of the missing nursing logs, and they performed extensive background checks, which showed Beverley's history of going into hospitals, seeking attention, and that pattern of behaviour matched a very serious personality disorder. She exhibited symptoms of both Munchausen syndrome and Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and they are both characterised by someone trying to get attention through illness. With Munchausen syndrome, physical or psychological symptoms are either self-inflicted or just plain faked, just to get attention. Munchausen's by proxy involves inflicting injury on others to gain attention for themselves. And I did also find that it is quite unusual for a person to have them both, and Beverley did. She had done it earlier on in her years, and then when that wasn't working out for her, she decides to inflict it on other people and get her attention that way. Despite visits and assessments from a number of health professionals while in prison, Beverley refused to admit what she'd done. After a series of hearings, she was charged with 4 counts of murder, 11 counts of attempted murder, and 11 counts of causing grievous bodily harm. On the 15th of February in 1993, after numerous delays due to her illnesses, she went to trial at Nottingham Crown Court, where prosecutors demonstrated the evidence that they had against her. The high insulin reading and obviously the potassium in each of the victims, as well as drug injection and puncture marks that were all linked to Beverley. She was further accused of cutting a victim's oxygen, either by smothering or tampering with the machines. It was Professor Meadows' opinion that Beverley would never be cured, making her a clear danger to anyone that she may come in contact with. After a trial of which lasted nearly 2 months, she only attended 16 days of these, let me just put in there, because of her illnesses. She was convicted on the 23rd of May in 1993. She was given 13 life sentences for murder and attempted murder. It was said that it was the harshest sentence at the time to ever be delivered to a female, but according to Mr. Justice Latham, it was commensurate with the horrific suffering of the victim, their families, and the bad impressions that she had brought upon the nursing profession. The impact that Beverley's case had on Grantham Hospital was so severe that they actually had to close their maternity department. She went to prison for 1 week before she was moved to Rampton Hospital. She refused to eat or drink while she was there and was actually diagnosed with having a psychological disorder, even though at the time of her capture and her trial, she was not deemed as seriously mentally ill, and she didn't meet the criteria to be transferred to a hospital. So go figure on that one. I did also read that before, as a trial was going on, Beverley spoke to friends and told them that she would not go to prison, which I guess is a wish that she did get. Rampton Secure Hospital is a high security facility housing mainly individuals that were detained under the Mental Health Act. As an inmate there, she began her attention-seeking behaviour once more. She consumed ground-up glass and poured boiling water on her hand. She subsequently admitted to 3 of the murders that she was charged with, as well as 6 of the assaults. The appalling nature of her crimes has placed her on the Home Office list of criminals who will never be eligible for parole. In August of 2006, Beverley appealed for a review of her sentence, which led to the probation service to contact her victims' families about the process. Beverley had spent 29 years in the hospital that she apparently enjoys more freedom and activities in, which obviously infuriates her victims and their families. Trevor McDonald did an eye-opening documentary in 2011 which shows how she had been a patient for more than 3 decades rather than a prisoner. The documentary, if you wish to look into it, is called Trevor McDonald and the Killer Nurse. Beverley Allitt is now 52 years old, and most likely she will spend the rest of her days in that hospital. My heart utterly breaks for the families, their children that was taken away from them because of this monster, and all she wanted was attention. That's the reason she did it for. I'm thankful that a lot of her interactions with her victims didn't result in their death, not for her lack of trying though, of course. This woman has affected so many lives, and many may argue that she hasn't served her justice at all. But yeah, that's the end of the case. If you guys have any suggestions you'd like me to look into, let me know and I will look into them for you. Give me a big thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you wish. Anyway guys, that's all I have today on the case of the Angel of Death, Beverley Allitt. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.